We're going to get started for the final segment of the day. We did give a little bit of an introduction to the conference this morning. As you're aware, there's about 600 people around the world streaming the World BCI conference from over 50 countries and 175 academic institutions. We had a great talk with Yasmin Salas from Goldman Sachs this morning. We have a wonderful series of talks this afternoon. And we really wanted to start with a talk this afternoon to kick off the conference that could give everybody a primer on what is BCI, what is augmented reality, what is virtual reality, how is AI incorporated into BCI. So my team in Toronto has been working with Sam Hosovsky from Monaco for the past 6 months. And we've been working on this talk that he can give to give a beautiful introduction. And he has expertise in all of these areas through his organization, UCAT. And I really want to thank him for coming. With delays, it took him 40 hours to fly here. He finally got here. So we're really grateful for him to be here. And Sam, would you please come up and share with us your talk?
Hello, everyone. Allow me a moment to get set up. Today I have prepared for you a 2-hour talk. And I was told that I have 20 minutes to present it. And I'm not a particularly fast talker. So we're going to see how this goes. But no, rest assured, I'm going to glide over some of the details. You can grab me for the presentation for any more details anytime you want. But the story I want to tell you today is the story of how do we go from the first 100 intracranial BCI users to the first 100 million to make brain-computer interfaces a mass product. I'm going to make an argument for a particular path we can take down this line. But the story, as always, it starts from the brain. Biomolecules inside of your brain allow you to comprehend what I'm saying right now in uncountable ways. We're not able to interface directly with them, but combining them together to form cells, we can observe spiking activity of individual neurons. We can even observe synapses and their activity. Now we have, first time in our history, technology available to us that allows us on this level of individual neurons or neuronal populations to communicate with our brains. First time merging artificial neural networks with biological ones. And this field in general is called brain-computer interfaces. By definition, by the BCI Society, a brain-computer interface is a system that measures brain activity and converts it in nearly real time into functionally useful outputs. And it may additionally also modify the brain. By this definition, the first real BCI that I could find was the NeuroPace system, the NeuroPace RNS system. You can have a look how bulky it is, but in 2010, they submitted to FDA their PMA application. And in their pivotal trial, they were able to reduce epileptic seizures by 80% by recording activity from the brain as the seizure was signaling its way into some of the cortical areas, and then using either an implanted probe or an ECOG strip to inhibit that activity. In the 2020s, actually in 2019, the DBS, adaptive DBS system by Medtronic submitted their PMA approval. Also a BCI system, if you ask me. There's a diagram to prove it. What is the 2030s going to look like? Is it the whole category of brain-computer interface going to be dominated by one company? Is it going to be Neuralink? Somebody else? I want to target your attention to this graph. And here, and we have 3 dimensions by which we can evaluate all the clinical trial stage companies building brain-computer interfaces that are high bandwidth. On the y-axis, we have channel count, the number of sensors that the systems exhibit. Pitch is how far apart these sensors are, and coverage is roughly the area that they can record or stimulate from. Over here, just because we only have 8 channels in both of these systems, we have our first 2 BCIs. So where does Neuralink sit? Before we get there, I want to show you how it's implanted, and just to show you a bit of a comparison between the different technologies I'm going to talk about. In this case, we have the R1 robot implanting 64 threads over the course of 10 to 15 minutes, each with 16 electrodes. These threads are just 5 micrometers thick. They're so small that a human surgeon cannot implant them, according to them. In Precision Neuroscience is another brain-computer interface startup. They use this microslit technique to place a high-dimensional ecog array on top of the brain surface in the subdural space. Synchron introduces their electrodes through the jugular vein that sit out just outside the brain and record activity. So if we were to plot Neuralink with a graph, it would sit somewhere around here. It's got about 1,000 channels, so 10 to 3. 200 microns is their pitch. Precision has a much larger coverage, but also 1,024 electrodes. And Synchron is down here with 16 electrodes. Something to consider is just how dense the neural tissue is in the cortex. Imagine putting these, so each of these cell bodies that you see popping up are about 10 microns in diameter. So imagine as you put, say, the Neuralink thread through the cortex, how much damage it causes inherently, right? These kinds of interfaces can really scale to the whole brain because there's this concept of a butcher's number, which is how many neurons do you kill per the ones that you record from. Neuralink kills 2 for every 1 that they record from, right? So you can see the trade-offs between invasiveness, signal quality that, for instance, these 3 technologies that I showed you deployed earlier implement. Next, we have paradromics. They're positioned somewhat close to number 2. Number 2 being the Utah array. I'd say that they're a fully, oversimplifying, a fully embedded, fully implantable, upgraded version of the Utah array with more channels, but the form factor remains similar. And I just wonder, out of the audience here, who here knows Axsoft? Have anybody heard of Axsoft? One person have heard of Axsoft. In similar way as I compared paradromics to Neuralink, Axsoft is somewhat comparable to paradromics to Utah array. Axsoft is comparable to Neuralink. But in their case, they can use 140 times thicker electrodes because they're so soft that they cause the same bio reaction, the foreign body reaction, as Neuralink. Yeah, but the Neuralink has to have very, very thin threads because of how inflexible they are. So I wanted to plot them there. And lastly, we have Neurosoft, whose unique characteristic is extreme scalability. The coverage that it can achieve through just a 40 millimeter burr hole in a preclinical study was 10 by 10 centimeters. And so what appears here is what I would call the golden triangle of sensorimotor BCIs. These are the characteristics that your system should exhibit in order to get us to these 100 million users that I was talking about earlier. So in a nutshell, a minimal 25 centimeter coverage, 25 centimeter squared, sub-millimeter resolution, and to go along with that, to populate that area, a minimum of 1,000 channels. And I'll go along and explain why this is the golden triangle, why is it so important in the next segment. I briefly want to just show you where some more experimental technologies are placed. I don't have the time to go over them, but here we have Forest, Science, Cohera, potentially millions of channels. So, but why sensorimotor is what we focus on? Well, it turns out that almost all the studies that were done with participants in intracranial BCI world were done with people who have some form of mobility or speech impairment. It's the most studied area of the brain, and or in general, this population can be defined as someone whose mind works, but their body refuses to. Either suddenly or progressively stripping their agency. Paralysis takes away expression, participation in society, independence. If we look at the macro population numbers for just a moment, the most severely paralyzed patients are what we call classically locked in, but derogatively somewhat, these are people refer to them as vegetables, because you cannot move your body whatsoever, except for your eyes. But your mind continues to be lively. 21 million people are severely paralyzed. Unlike the first category, this 21 million is quite heterogeneous in terms of etiologies, the causes of their conditions. They're characterized by requiring an electric wheelchair with postural support to get around, or the use of augmentative communication devices. 100 million people, and now we're getting into those numbers that I started with, need speaking aids to express themselves, and 1.7% of the world's population struggles to move because of paralysis, some form of paralysis. That's the 136 million people. And if we expand this purple box of 21 million people, we can look into the costs of care. Over $300,000 per year is spent on a severely paralyzed patient. There are some costs that can be reduced with a BCI, for instance, the requirement for non-stop attendant care. An overlooked cost that should be also considered is the cost of lost wages. 85% of those 1.7%, 136 million people are unemployed. 85% of people are unemployed with paralysis. So now let's take the micro level, and here I'll just go through the demonstrations. I won't be able to go into the details of what people with typically severe paralysis in clinical trials were able to achieve with technologies before those that I showed you, right? Before these bigger scaled up commercial systems. I'll use Broadman areas to help us. Here we have the PPC region. This is Anderson's group that was able to decode trajectories of 2D cursor control from an area that typically doesn't have them. They were also doesn't encode them. They also were able to encode targets 200 milliseconds before you initiated your movement, so motor plans. Using an ECOG array, Chestec was able to, for instance, decode different 4 classes of hand positions. But the more studied area is the motor cortex for obvious reasons. Shah from the BrainGate consortium were able to decode all of the American Sign Alphabet gestures using ucat arrays and for a person to communicate through them, and also continuous movement of individual fingers. The by far best performing BCI for ages has been the one created by the Cortical Bionics group. In their case, they're able to do 10-dimensional control of a robotic arm that you can see over here, manipulating objects of daily living. And in a similar way, this is a BrainGate trial. Here we have 4 dimensions of control. By the way, both of these highlighted ones have used virtual reality to train the users. I'll get back to that point later. Controlling a cursor on a tablet and allow the BrainGate participants to communicate via text. Willett et al. At Stanford was able to decode 32 different effectors across the body. So as you tend to move your ankles, your arms, your fists, your elbows, all of those could be decoded. So simultaneous both hands attempted to move resulted in the control of 2 cursors. And in Neuralink, rock, paper, scissors, shoot, they were able to decode wrist flexion and individual finger movement. And then additionally, they were able to decode 8-dimensional continuous avatar.
Cultural challenges with this project was figuring out which motions were going to be mapped to the joystick. We started with the typical left thumb and right thumb, but quickly found that the dominant hand overshadowed the non-dominant hand. My personal favorite is we had one of our participants imagine walking for the left joystick and aiming for the right joystick. So in-game, they were simply doing naturalistic motions, like you might do in virtual reality in Ready Player One. And that was really cool to watch.
Another area, inferior frontal gyrus, is like on the other side of the brain, but it also shows that it can encode movement across the body as you attempt to move your tongue all the way down to your ankle. So this paints the picture that movement is really encoded as distributed across the brain as anything. And it gives rise to, or gives support to this argument of massive coverage of a system, it being beneficial. And this is work from Maastricht. On the speech side, I'm going to play you 2 videos to show you just how fast we could decode somebody's speech into text. This study on the left is 15 words per minute. It actually is the reason why we started ucat. It was possible for the first time to decode your thoughts into actual text. But then it gets scaled up by BrainGate using the first one was using an ECOG array. This one is a ucat array. to 65 words a minute and a massive vocabulary of 150,000 words with fairly high accuracy. And in addition, bring it in this study, we're able to also decode facial movements with high accuracy. So, so many dimensions. Let's continue.
I was thinking about running to the store.
Here we have...
What time will you be home?
Cheng Lab. Right? She's thinking...
In about an hour.
And her avatar speaks for her. So now the question is, if we can acquire this rich signal from across the body, what do we do with it that's the most beneficial for the end user? There's a number of applications that people are considering. Exoskeletons, I'll just go left to right, are incredibly immature. They're bulky and they're not dexterous enough to be implemented yet. Neural bypass works to a limited extent. There's not so much fidelity that you can implement. It's limited by the stimulation that you perform. Prosthetics allow you to control a robotic arm. This is somewhat becoming more feasible, but still the arm that you want to control with high level of dexterity costs $150,000. Not quite what you can reimburse for. PC control is the first application of these high bandwidth BCIs that the companies are peddling more and more. They're saying their argument is essentially that if I can move the cursor twice as fast and twice as accurately as with eye tracker, somebody can reimburse me for $60,000 as opposed to $1,000 for an eye tracker. But I think we can do a lot more. So one place where the end user could completely forget that they were even paralyzed is inside the metaverse. Well, there's no limitation on what you can use the data for if you have acquired it across the body. So if you want, you can talk, you can paint, you can run, you can work, you can shop, you can design, you can do everything you do in your normal life without appearing to be paralyzed, being indistinguishable from other users that you meet. Here's just some experiences that you can do inside VR. This first one is called Gravity Sketch, and here popular brands like Nissan, I think, Ford are designing cars, internally working on the design together collaboratively. In this example, you're attending a class. You can either give the task or a class, or you can attend it. So virtual reality education has huge potential. This is a signing class. This application is from Microsoft. It's called Mesh. You can interface between virtual worlds and things like Teams, right? Calls. So you can attend the call through your avatar. In fact, that's how I've been working for the last 3 months or so. Last, I want to show you
what is reality.
What the worlds could be.
Obviously, no one can say because it isn't words. It isn't material, that's just an idea. Reality is the find cannot be explained.
So I'll skip that for now, but this is what you can experience. These are all existing worlds that people have created, and you can visit them. You can be there with your friends and with your loved ones. If we can decode your entire body. In fact, I lied earlier. You're not just on par with an everyday user. You become a super user. I have to wear all these trackers you see on the left side to get the motions of my body into VR. A person whose entire body has been decoded has those affordances by default by having the BCI. This one in the middle is something you wear above your nose to decode your facial expressions. So it's the same story there. And we close this gap with my company, ucat. So in the nutshell, we're the software stack that turns the motor cortex into the highest resolution input device. Right, we're targeting avatars, virtual avatars to begin with. And I have 2 products I can briefly talk to you about. One I'll show you demos of. So one is that we try to take all of these decoded motions, these kinematics from across the body, and plot them on avatars so that they look as naturalistic as my motions or yours. Not jagged, but really indistinguishable from other users. We also try to utilize as much of residual movement as possible that the person with paralysis still has access to, and then create their virtual replica. This is the proprietary stuff. The open source product that we encourage all motor BCI researchers to use is a participant training software. An application where as a participant in these motor BCI trials, you come in and you're shown exercises to perform in order to calibrate your decoder. As we saw earlier, those kinds of mimicry of virtual arms during training leads to the best performing decoders anyway. So we should definitely be using these things more in research. We place the user in a calm environment surrounded by an audiovisual experience that makes them focused but also relaxed. UCAT is their personal guide that takes them through all of these exercises. First one, you
When the dots disappear,
that
repeat the word on the top half.
just decodes one word to begin with, and you slowly progress from one word to a set of words. Once you can do phrases, you're able to access our menu. So this is a live demo, or it's a demo of something we show to a client. So here you have to say, hey, UCAT. Once you do that, a menu opens with all kinds of levels and modes you can access. So this may be the first time in decades a person with severe paralysis can have agency over what they do and where they go. Okay, some other modes allow them to just take notes. And this last one, we actually fine-tune a language model into UCAT so that she can have a real-time conversation with the end user about the BCIs, about the BCI implant that they're having. So one thing that I didn't mention that I want to point out real quick is that so far we've been talking about read, how you can read the motor commands and then interpolate them on some effectors. But you can also write to the brain. And I want to show you what happens when you can encode patterns of touch into the somatosensory cortex of these participants. By comparison, on the left is when they have the percepts of touch. They can feel the tactile forces of things that they're interacting with. On the right, they don't. They rely on their vision to grasp objects. So to restore the sense of touch to people with paralysis who've lost it, in the case of spinal cord injury, this is almost everyone, you're able to significantly enhance the usability of these kinds of motor BCIs that control robotics or control your avatars even. Obviously, we can simulate all of those objects and those write inputs into the brain in VR. There's nothing stopping us from doing it. Further, so this was the Cortical Bionics group. They further did a lot more studies, as you can see by the dots, quantifying what exactly is that the participants are feeling. So different fingers need to be stimulated with different patterns of activity in S1. Individual motions of the arm, on the hand can be felt. Here's Scott explaining how a particular stimulation led him to feel like he's able to pick up keys, for instance. And so you can imagine now that with this level of dexterity, participants, once robotic applications are mature, can interact with all kinds of daily objects around them, right? Become a lot more independent and reduce the cost of care. So even if you don't believe in this metaverse vision that I have outlined, where people become their avatars and live through virtual reality, I encourage motor BCI researchers to use a lot more VR in their studies. It is the best way to collect clean data samples for movements across the body. Yeah, you can distinguish between this and that very easily because you can show that on the avatar and tell the user to repeat that or the other, and there's a particular neural correlate associated with all those movements. You can't do that in 2D. It's a stepping stone for controlled robotics. Imagine that you can bring the robot and all of its hardware, model it inside VR. Well, what is stopping you to then, once performance thresholds are reached, take that decoder and literally control a robotic arm that's attached to the wheelchair? And you can simulate all kinds of ADLs, activities of daily living, in VR. Make sure that the product that you're selling is incredibly robust. You can quantify attention with built-in eye tracking. It's important to know whether your decoders are robust to, say, fatigue or just loss of attention. Often that information is, in fact, also represented in the areas that I showed you earlier on the Broadman areas on the brain. And you can validate extreme operating conditions. Say that there's a fire that breaks out. Well, you can simulate that in VR, and you can see what happens to the BCI performance, right? Am I no longer able to control my wheelchair now that there's a fire or that the bird flew into my house? You need to be able to account for all of these things if you want to sell reliable products. Together, this can be taken, I'm sure you get the reference, that the first 100 million users are going to be living in some sort of a matrix. But it doesn't have to be as dystopian as the show picks it up to be. And this is the reason why communities like the World BCI Forum are incredibly important in this age. We need to work across the stack and across and across the whole continent together to figure out some of these very difficult problems of how do we bring these devices to market in a overly optimistic way. And with that, I'm just going to leave it here, open it up for a few questions. If you want to scan this code, it takes you to a book that I wrote, of which this presentation was a short list. So thank you very much. Any questions anybody wants to ask before I leave it to the next person?
Really outstanding. That was fantastic. So 2 questions and 1 fantasy. So the question is, do you see an environment, how the concept of dealing with hardware obsolescence at the rate of change that we're seeing right now? So you've seen, quantum qubits change from 10 to 15 to 1200 in the last few years, addressing issues such as refresh rate, latency, error tolerance, differences between augmented systems and what humans can do, right? So the rate at which these implants are going in, there will be an inherent need for revision, change, etc. So that's the first question, especially when we're in this adaptive phase. The second question is a little more provocative. If these systems are sensor-based as a communication between effector systems, sensor, and then the output, do you ever see an environment of communication without a sensor system directly implanted?
Yeah, obviously there are assistive technologies, to answer your second question, that allow us to sense people's intentions, motor intentions, by, say, wearable technologies. There are some, I cannot talk about some stealth startups that try to do this by trying to pick out to the very, very fine and whatever is left muscle activity with an EMG sensor on the throat of a person with dysarthria, inability to speak intelligibly or comprehensively. So there are solutions. It's just the problem that none of the solutions can get us to the degrees of freedom that you can get to once you have access to motor cortex or access all the brain areas that I have pointed out. That's the big difference. So you're able to, with eye tracking, have like a 2-dimensional control over a cursor, 2 dimensions, but with something like a system, like a Neurasoft system that spans a 10 by 10 centimeter area, you could decode 80 degrees of freedom, which constitutes all of the voluntary joints that you can control. Whole body. That's a new paradigm altogether. To your first question, I'm not quite sure I fully understand it, but if it refers to removability, right, and upgradability of these implants, I think that's a valid concern. It's a concern not only for the purposes of upgrading to better systems in the future, but also for abandonment. What happens when the company goes out of business and you're left with a BCI you cannot remove? Right? So take all those things in considerations when you decide which form factors of implantable BCIs are the ones that you should back.
Well, actually, a question to robotic abandonment of one part of it, but working economic environment in which, that's one part of it. Working in an economic environment in which healthcare reimbursements are a core challenge. So market's going to drive behavior at the end of the day. The concern is implantable revisions, and then the costs associated with revisions that are associated with it, right? We see it in other industries with implants. I'm not saying, it's not a pejorative statement. It's just an observation around how the economic environment is going to play into that.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure you can also re-ask the question, because some of the BCI manufacturers here directly have to tackle that problem. I just want to say that if you consider quali being something most countries would pay for $50,000 to $100,000, so long as you can prove that in, say, 15 years you can gain that quali over an eye tracker, you're going to get a reimbursement, right? And this is what the game is about in terms of economic incentives. And I'm saying that you can have a better chance of gaining a reimbursement if you can embody a virtual avatar that gives you all of your expression back that you've lost over something that works twice as fast as an eye tracker to begin with. I have to say, the writing capabilities of the sensory input that I showed you in S1, that's completely immature. There are no companies that I know of that are actually pursuing this in commercial clinical trials, right? So there you go. A revision in the future might be the ability to restore somebody's touch, but some of these can be also software improvements. Like some of the devices are designed in such a way where the electrodes are both recording and stimulating, and over time, improvements can be delivered without an open range surgery. I think we're out of time massively. Thank you very much.